Hello and welcome to this RISE webinar on the role of bureaucracies in successful education reform. Please welcome our host, Carmen Balafi.
Thank you, Jamie. And on behalf of RISE, a very warm welcome to this final RISE webinar of 2020. And we will be talking about bureaucracies and bureaucrats today. A topic that some people might associate with, it perhaps being a bit technical or even a bit dry. But I hope that today's conversation can paint a very different picture of a structure or a subsystem that is very much alive, very dynamic, and has its own logic and motivation. We know that bureaucracies play a central role in the function of education systems and in the provision of public services, and not just in education, but more general. And they have a very difficult job because they need to translate words and political will into action and change on the ground. That is very difficult, but that also means that they can make or break reforms. And yet their role is often underestimated or considered an afterthought, and even their internal dynamics are often not well understood. And to help us understand that a bit more, we have a brilliant panel today that will take us on a deep dive into bureaucracies and bureaucrats. So we will learn about their internal logic, we will learn about how bureaucracies can contribute to overall system coherence or incoherence. We will learn a bit more about who bureaucrats actually are and perhaps how we could be thinking about them a bit differently. And the panel will also discuss possibilities to create or improve bureaucratic will and motivation of bureaucrats, and also talk about how we can create accountability structures that actually help us improve the system. In doing so, we will have the two panelists give 15-minute presentations each, after which we will have about 20 minutes of panel discussion. And then for the last 30 minutes of this webinar, we will be moving to an open Q&A part. And we already invite all of you to send us your questions via the Q&A feature that you can see at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So send them throughout this event. If you already have questions now, you can feel free to already send them now. And we will try to answer as many as possible in the final 30 minutes of this webinar. And we're not doing this alone. It's my great pleasure to introduce to you the chair of today's session, Ritva Ranka, who is a professor of practice at Aalto University and the Helsinki Graduate School of Economics. She brings with her decades of experience as an economist in development. She worked for UNICEF, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Finland, and spent many years at the World Bank, where, among other positions, she was the Director of Human Development in the Africa region. And not least, she's also the former chair of the RISE Delivery Board. We are very delighted to have her with us today. And without any further ado, Ritva, handing over to you.
Thank you very much, Carmen. And thank you for inviting me to chair this webinar on the topic of bureaucracies and bureaucrats and their role in educational reform. And I do have to say that when I think of the education systems, that I personally have been also involved in researching some aspects of it. It is most often for me that I've been dealing with bureaucrats. So I'm looking forward very much to the presentation and the conversation on this topic, how to make it exciting, how to delve into the bureaucratic sometimes vastness. And so I very much welcome this topic and look forward to the presentations and the discussions. What I want to do just now is introduce the panelists. As Carmen said, we will have two presentations of about 15 minutes each. And we will start with Yamini Iyer. And you have seen her CV in the announcement of the webinar, but I'll just highlight some key issues about Yamini. And she is President and Chief Executive of Center for Policy Research in India. And her research is in the area of social policy and development. And her work is widely known both and recognized in both academic and policy circles. She's also part of the country research teams that are the backbone of the RISE program, Research on Improving Systems of Education. A little over 10 years ago, Yamini founded the Center for Policy Research, the Center's accountability initiative, which has produced significant research in governance, state capacity, and social policy. Among other things, this initiative carried out India's largest public expenditure tracking survey in basic education. Yamini is also active in open government partnership, and she has previously worked at the World Bank as well in Delhi, the country office, where she focused on action research aimed at strengthening citizen engagement in local government. So she will talk us first on the Delhi education revolution. What I will do also is just introduce the second speaker, so I will not come with another introduction in between. So that is the perspective of sort of ethnographic research and a kind of comprehensive look on this major reform in Delhi. Dan Hornik instead will come up with the same topic but a different take. But first about Dan is that he's assistant professor of international development at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. We know it as SAIS. And he is also a non-resident fellow at the Center for Global Development in Washington, DC. Dan's research focuses on the relationship between organizational structure, management practice, and performance in both developing country governments and also in foreign aid organizations. His work on mission-driven bureaucrats explores the role of motivation, including research in a number of countries. He has worked in Bangladesh, Ghana, Thailand, and also in the United States, his home country. Dan is currently in the Netherlands, actually. He's a visiting fellow at Leiden University. It's Institute of Political Science there. So we are actually spread all over the place. Yamini is in India. Dan is in the Netherlands. Just to add that Dan has also held operational positions in both developing country government as an advisor in Liberia and several activities with NGOs. So he will focus, his presentation will focus us on the education bureaucrats and the role of motivation and how to be supportive of that motivation. So this is really in terms of introductions, and what I would like to do now is invite Yamini first for your presentation of the first 15 minutes. Then we hear from Dan and have a little panel discussion after that. So over to you. Welcome, Yamini.
We did say before we started that the one thing we always forget to do is to unmute ourselves. I began by doing just that. But thank you very much, Ritva, for that very generous introduction. And I should add that we were very much inspired to do expenditure tracking, thanks in no small measure to everything that we learned from your work, which really sort of propelled us into thinking in this direction. And one day I have to sit with you and tell you about the complexity of our public finance management systems that made it quite difficult to arrive at anything as significant and relevant as your work in Uganda. In fact, it was through that experience of expenditure tracking that I spent a lot of time with bureaucrats and discovered that in fact bureaucrats are anything but technical and boring. They are indeed rather complex creatures of the state and shape everything that we know and experience about the state in our everyday lives. Much as we focus on politicians, it is the bureaucrats that are tasked with converting all the grand ideas of our politicians into action. And this is really what we've been trying to study, and some bits of it I'm going to present to you. Narratives of education reform, certainly in India, and I think across the globe as well, have focused a lot on the questions of what it takes to shape the classroom. And particularly in India, over the last 15 odd years, we've made significant progress, at least in terms of our elite policy debates, of moving the needle a little bit away from an exclusive focus on building schooling inputs to asking ourselves the question of how does that actually translate into the experience of learning for students inside classrooms. And in fact, particularly in the last few years in India, whenever you go to meet characters like this one that I'm showing you in this picture up here, you'll hear everybody suddenly saying to us, oh yes, we have to figure out how to handle the learning problem. Children are coming to school and not learning. And when we push the conversation to say, what does that mean? The conversation inevitably finds its way into a narrative framed by all these files and papers that you see lying around. It inevitably becomes a conversation about the bureaucracy, the context in which the bureaucracy exists, the education system is framed, its own understandings of its personality, of its hierarchies, of its modus operandi. And it is trying to shake up a system very much using these tools that it is familiar with. It is, when I once described what we were learning from our work in Delhi, Lance said to me, oh, this sounds like when you go to England with your India plug and then you keep trying to push it into the socket and think that a miracle will happen. It's very much like that. The system is trying to reform itself, but reforming itself with the India plug in a UK, no, I'm going to change that given our history. It's trying to reform the India plug with a UK socket, which really causes all kinds of problems. And it was to unearth this that we began a deep dive into what was happening in Delhi. As the policy narrative began to move in the direction of a more concerted focus on education reforms, a lot of the debate amongst researchers, development professionals, and others was very much around trying to unpack the critical question of under what conditions does a politician or does a political structure or a state that is vested in viewing education in a particular way move in the direction of focusing on education outcomes, on learning outcomes in classrooms. We said to ourselves, perhaps we are asking the wrong question. There are contexts in which politicians too find incentives to start focusing on education reforms. But under what conditions do bureaucrats like this, who are tasked actually at the grassroots with implementing these reforms, changing the dynamic of the classroom, actually move the needle? And in order to understand this, we found ourselves remarkably lucky to be in a context where a newly elected government in the city-state of Delhi, which is where I live, that for a whole host of reasons chose to focus its political attention on institutionalizing what it called in its own terms an education revolution in Delhi. All the preconditions of reform that we look for were well in place. A committed political structure with a committed set of political policy actors at the highest level, a very clear understanding or articulation at any rate of what they wanted to do. This government reached out to a number of NGOs, including Pratham, that is very much part of the RICE consortium as well, and has pioneered thinking on the importance of learning outcomes in India's education system, and adopted sort of its own adaptive version of teaching at the right level that I think many in the audience will be familiar with, but for those who aren't, want, it is a sort of an approach to the classroom that recognizes that there is a lot of heterogeneity in learning levels inside the classroom when you look at the classroom from its age grade metric, and that there is a need to, in order to be able to get children to the level of where curriculum is, there is a need to focus on those children that are significantly further behind. So reorganizing teaching by students' learning levels rather than teaching locked into the age grade metrics, which is the context of classrooms in India. This was a tried and tested method, certainly in elementary schools. In the context of what we were studying, it was done in secondary schools. But again, you could argue that the tool of reform was tried and tested. There was a clear set of things that were going to be implemented. And so it seemed to be the perfect setting to see. So when you have all these conditions right, how does the system actually respond? The only way in which we could actually study this was through the adoption of ethnographic approaches. I'm not going to go into any details on methodology. We can take those up in the Q&A because I have a lot to share with you on why bureaucrats are not technocratic and boring. And when you talk to them, you learn all sorts of things and get all sorts of strange quotations when pieced together, give you a really sense of what a rather difficult and dreadful life this poor chap has to lead when he's implementing all the grand reforms that our political elites and development systems push towards them. We've tracked this system over a period of 3 years. And I think the first place where I would like to start really is to give you a sense of what it means to be an education bureaucrat in Delhi and indeed all across India. Everything that a bureaucrat does is shaped by circulars and orders that are pushed through by the higher end of the education system. So they come from officers sitting at the higher level, far removed from the schools, writing orders and circulars. In the 3 years that we studied our schools, we created a database of about 8,000 odd government orders and circulars related to a whole range of activities that were to be implemented in the schools. And don't forget, bureaucracies are extremely hierarchical. Bureaucracies that were formed, whose origins can be traced back to the colonial legacy, are even more hierarchical. Layered onto them, the social context of India, you have the perfect hierarchy that there ever was. Even I, when I go to meet bureaucrats, or refer to them as sir and madam, rather than by their first name, which is mostly how I talk to all my bosses. So there is a social context of hierarchy within which the bureaucracy exists. There is a historical context in which that hierarchy got articulated through paper. And it is in that historical context, it is that combination of that historical and social context that makes the everyday life of bureaucracy in India. Everything that a bureaucrat does in the education system is, in the words of the head of school, one of the head of schools that we interviewed, it's about moving from circular to circular. And I know that I will follow these instructions in an unquestioning manner because I don't want DDE, is the acronym for his boss, hammering down at me at any random point of time. So the circulars are sacrosanct. We have to follow them. We fought for 3 hours over whether the words in the circular meant and or while categorizing them related to a new scheme. As long as you keep following the orders and sending data, you're a good worker. So the circulars both constrain how the local bureaucrat functions. They tell the local bureaucrat what they have to do. And the structure of the hierarchy is designed such that in this organizational structure, if you follow the circulars to the T, you are a good performer. If you misinterpret the and or to be maybe, you're certainly not a particularly good performer and you risk your bosses rapping on your knuckles. It is a hierarchical top-down structure. In this hierarchical top-down structure, the classroom too gets interpreted in a particular way. In our conversations with teachers, we often spoke to them about what they see as the critical elements of what makes a good classroom. They all spoke of what we describe parts of the classroom consensus, a tyranny of syllabus completion, textbooks and pass percentages dominating what makes a good classroom. And the reason this syllabus completion, textbook, and pass percentage dominate the good classroom, because in a hierarchical, circular-driven bureaucracy, these are tangible inputs through which one can actually measure a classroom. So teachers will often tell you that I'm aware of my students' learning levels, but I have to complete the syllabus. And the completing the syllabus is not because it's not just about framing the syllabus as the be and end all of the education system, which is certainly part of the problem. It also gets translated this way down the line, because in hierarchies, you need clearly defined deliverables to be able to judge performance. Don't forget, performance in this bureaucracy is very much about following rules and orders. And so it entrenches a system of rote learning. As one teacher said to me, and I think it best describes the education system in India as a whole, online teaching means I have to sit through some of my kids' classes, and it's a stark reminder of how much rote learning I too have done in my life, and it carries on through generations. One teacher said, forget understanding, just apply rote learning and pass the examination. I will be happy as a teacher. But this is not because this is how teachers think about teaching. Teachers do actually have a very acute understanding of what it means to be a good teacher. In various surveys that we did with teachers, when we asked them what being a good teacher was, they had an imagination about it. They spoke about conceptual learning. They spoke about the importance of moving away, in fact, from rote learning to understanding. Only 6% refer to the syllabus. But yet they saw the syllabus and examination as a dysfunctional property of the classroom that has to be accepted, because after all, this is a hierarchical, order-driven system. It is into this structure that the reformers tried to infuse some creative disruption. They did this by trying to push the needle, speaking directly to teachers, appealing to their own account, their professional norms as teachers. I used to drive through the city and put on my radio, and I would stunned to find on many occasions the deputy chief minister, second most important person in the government, speaking on the radio, telling all of us that teachers are the most important pillars of our society. They are transformative. We need to respect them, talking to teachers. Yet, for a system that is obsessed only with paperwork, the interpretation of this caused its own challenges. Teachers would tell us, despite everything that the deputy chief minister said, I've lost my identity as a teacher. We are more into clerical jobs. Their own professional norms are very much shaped by this burden of paperwork that demands what they think is a lot of administrative work. When we dived into it, we found it commanded only about 36% of their time. But the tyranny of the paper requires teachers to constantly think of themselves very much as locked in to this hierarchy and this paperwork that converts them into administrators, and also doesn't allow them to do their job. So teachers describe themselves as victims of systems that don't empower them to teach. When you ask
me 2 more minutes.
Sure. And it is in this system that as the government tried to appeal differently to teachers, they also got caught in the traditional way in which the bureaucracy tries to do things. I'm going to share with you here, just as one last episode, and then I'll conclude, of efforts of when you try to change. The government tried to change the way in which teachers interacted with parents and try to infuse in teachers the power to talk to parents about the importance of teaching, learning, and the experiences of what students were to learn in their classrooms through a parent-teacher meeting. These two boxes here, don't bother reading them. They're just to show you what government circulars look like, laced in legalese. The deputy chief minister came on radio and announced and sent a letter to teachers and parents saying, please come for the parent-teacher meeting and talk to the teachers about how well your child is learning, and ask the teacher questions. The government bureaucracy had to issue an order, otherwise the parent-teacher meeting would not unfold. And that order essentially said, here's a whole list of things that you have to do when the parents come. Make sure that there's some tea, make sure that there are some biscuits, make sure that you talk to the parents about the report card, completely taking away from the nuances of what the reformers were trying to do. It's not the bureaucrats' fault. This is the organizational culture in which they are embedded. As the policy reformers sought to understand the context in which they were driving reforms, they also did a few really important things that I believe are the key drivers of long-term change. They introduced a consistent narrative of a conversation about the classroom in schools, including through their orders, but also through trainings and other discussions and deliberations that they had on a regular basis with the schools and the teachers. They created a new cadre of what they hoped would be change agents, whose job it was to consistently engage with teachers about the art of teaching. Now, of course, these change agents also come from the same bureaucratic system. So often those conversations found themselves locked yet again in legalese, bureaucracies, and hierarchies. But the presence of these change agents and the repeated conversations about the classroom shifted the dynamic just a little somewhat in these schools over the 3 years that we tracked them. Teachers began talking about the classroom from the prism of passing their students, but also from the point of view of how far away children were from where they needed to be in order to pass the exam better. A subtle shift, but a very important one in bringing recognition into the school of the importance of talking about pedagogy and talking about learning. I will close by saying this: when we look for reforms and when we talk about systems reforms, we often focus on changing the terms of the contract. We often focus on the technical tools that we can introduce to reshape, to better monitor and to better manage the frontline, the bureaucrats that are tasked with implementing reforms. But these very bureaucrats operate in an ecosystem, as I have just tried to lay out for you. And change will only be driven when we are able to slowly and carefully infuse small changes in how bureaucrats and frontline actors, particularly the teachers, perceive themselves, understand their roles, and carve out spaces of empowerment in contexts that are, by definition, hierarchical, bureaucratic, and paper-driven. More rules, more monitoring through papers will only serve to undermine the core objectives of the reforms of changing education systems that we seek. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Yamini. Fascinating, fascinating narrative. And now we press on, and I would just like to call upon Dan Hornik in the Netherlands. Over to you for your presentation for 15 minutes. Dan.
Thank you so much, Rifa. And first, just to echo Yamini, such an honor to be here. I've learned so much from your work over the years, and really looking forward to the conversation. And Yamini, if every time I ever talk about bureaucrats, you could go first, I think I would really appreciate that, because I thought that was fantastic. In fact, I modified these slides a bit while you were talking to try to pull in some of your language. And let me say, so Ritva very kindly framed in my current book project on mission-driven bureaucrats. Let me say this literally right now is my first time ever trying to present the kind of theoretic framework of that book or that book project. So feedback very welcome on any and all parts. I think so what I'm going to do is kind of lay out that framework a bit, and then shift to trying to apply it to education settings. So thank you for your time and attention. So first, just to kind of pick up exactly where Yamini left off, public sector management reform efforts often focus on monitoring, measurement, and control as tools to drive performance improvements, right? So this can involve target setting, for example, Yamini's tyranny of syllabus completion. It can involve instruction and regulations, the circulars and orders we just heard so much about. I love, by the way, that circulars are named circulars, because they drive you around in a circle or pull you around in a circle. And often we see measurement as a control mechanism as part of this. That is often, though not always, ICT enabled. Textbook completion and pass percentages in the example Yamini just gave. And increasingly that monitoring, that measurement is linked to rewards and incentives such as pay for performance. And this is all drawing very much from what Yamini was saying, based on a kind of logic of command and control. And I'm going to describe that logic as what I want to call root X, which is in red. It's the red path on the bottom of the slide here. So by root X, and I should say these names, root X and root Y, are drawn from Douglas McGregor's foundational management work. on theory X and theory Y. So, a root X approach assumes that you have people, frontline bureaucrats, teachers, bureaucrats in general, who are not going to do a good job unless you force them to. And if that's the case, what you want to do is you want to force the employee to work towards the mission of the organization. You want to induce alignment of the actions of the employee and the mission, and you're going to do that through incentives and penalties, right? You're going to control. You're going to try to put cheese in front of the route to draw people to run in the right direction. On the other hand, if what we have are employees who care, or importantly can come to care about the goals of the agency, about the mission of the agency, potentially mission-driven bureaucrats, we want to follow a route Y approach. And what do I mean by a route Y approach? What is the idea of kind of theory Y? It's that we're going to get the best performance when we empower the bureaucrats, when we empower the employee, when we empower the teacher, and we're going to do that through supportive management practices. What do I mean by supportive management practices? I mean things like giving the employees sufficient autonomy. I mean things like making sure that they have help in exercising their judgment, in getting better, in thinking about what they're doing and how to improve it, right? And a connection to the sort of benefits of their work. And what I mean by that is, if what I care about is the impact of my job, then connecting, allowing me to see that what I do in fact has impact, in fact leads to improvement, itself will help kindle my motivational fire and keep me oriented towards achieving the mission of the organization. And everything we talked about is everything Yamini talked about was about the kind of inherent logic of the Delhi education system as a root X place, as a place, no pun intended, rooted in root X thinking. And I want to argue that root Y is often a better choice. And it is increasingly a better choice. I can talk more about the kind of details of this in Q&A, when the job is more multitask. What that means is the greater the extent to which what we want the employee to do is something where some parts of it are monitorable and some parts of it aren't, the more we have to worry that if we kind of take a root X approach, we are going to get performance on the monitorable bits, right? Root X will drive performance in that regard, but that's going to prompt underinvestment in all the parts we can't monitor. If it's all about monitoring, then any ground undefended is going to be lost. Any place that's not monitored is not going to see as rich performance. And it's increasingly, the value of root Y goes up when we need soft information to do the job well. When doing a good job relies on details of the situation, of the environment, that only the person situated there can see, involving soft information, tacit knowledge, and it thus can't sort of be outsourced to fully to monitoring and control. So, this alternative I'm pitching here, this kind of root Y idea, obviously requires us to think a lot about who those bureaucrats are, who are doing the work, who are driving the system. And here are some claims which are totally contestable. You can absolutely disagree with them, and I look forward to discussing as and where you do. So first, I think lots of bureaucrats, including in educational administration and teachers, frontline bureaucrats, street-level bureaucrats, etc., in fact care about their agency's mission. Indeed, it is often one of the reasons they took the job they have, is because they care about actually the thing for which they are employed. I also think that intrinsically motivated bureaucrats in general do their job better if they are given sort of the ability, the space to do so. And I think bureaucrats, and here I think this actually applies to pretty much all human beings, generally find tight oversight and lots of instruction irritating and in fact demotivating. If I got the sense that my management system in the organization I worked in really thought I was really not that good a guy, and if they did not monitor and tightly control me, I was going to do bad things, well, I think that would not encourage me to work harder at my job. In fact, I think that would encourage me to work less hard at my job and only do the things on which I was measured. So, let's take this as a model. It's kind of a stylized, not terribly formal model, but what are two implications of what I've said so far? Well, I would say the first is that we should expect management and motivation to co-vary, right? So that is to say, where we see more supportive management practice, we should expect to see higher levels of intrinsic motivation and vice versa. And if indeed I'm right, and if Yamini will join me, Yamini's right in kind of her assessment of the situation, at least as I read it, that we have way too much command and control, that we're stuck in a root X world even when it's inappropriate, well, then we should expect on the margin, as we see kind of reform efforts, that root Y reform efforts will outperform root X reform efforts where we can get them to take hold, right? Where we can actually get something to grow out of the soil. So to that first point, the covariation, this is from some of my own work looking at over 4 million employees and over 2,000 agencies. We see indeed that supportive management practice and motivation, intrinsic motivation, co-vary. What do I mean by supportive management practice? I mean things like autonomy, things like having a clear objective for your work, things like psychological safety, having recognition perception, the idea that if I do a good job, somebody will notice. And I should say these are models, what you're seeing here is with agency fixed effects, right? So this is looking within agency over time as perceptions of supportive management practice go up. So too do self-reported intrinsic motivation. So what about to that second claim, that kind of route Y versus route X head-to-head? So we see, I think, lots of evidence framed this way that route Y performs better at the margin. So Yasser Khan, in his job market paper, I should say, if you're part of an econ department and hiring, he's on the job market this year, finds that in an RCT, that encouraging mission motivation yields greater performance gains than does financial rewards. And to the multitask point that I made before, he finds that the financial rewards, which are for only some of the things healthcare workers are meant to do, leads to more of the thing that is financially incentivized and less of everything else. He finds that just encouraging people to identify with the mission, just messaging basically, leads to greater performance gains across the board on the things that, and that leads to performance gains both on the parts that the financial incentive can see, that root X can draw attention towards, and on all the things it can't. And this kind of stylized finding is echoed in studies of Nigerian infrastructure, in studies of Pakistani procurement, where another very well identified RCT finds that procurement agents in Pakistan procuring goods like A4 paper, so super simple things that we might think are extremely monitorable, that more autonomy, that relaxing procurement rules leads to lower prices paid, leads to better performance, then does a pay for performance scheme that rewards employees for getting lower prices. And I would consider that a fairly high bar test for this theory. In a study across the Ghanaian public sector, Rasool, Rager, and Williams argue that more discretionary autonomy is associated with better performance, especially for tasks that are ill-suited to predefined monitoring. So let's take this model back to school and move towards the multitask classroom. So we can often measure tests and teachers showing up, and maybe not so much else. So there are lots of process control, lots of those circulars, lots of those orders. And root X and focusing on those things does usefully promote the observable things. People follow the legalese in those extremely detailed circulars. They make sure the T is there as part of the parent-teacher meeting when so specified in the circular. And indeed, research shows this, right? So in a quite famous study in India, Esther Duflo and co-authors find that putting a camera in a classroom and requiring the teacher to take their picture to get paid leads to more teachers showing up. And to the extent that teachers showing up is a necessary, if not a sufficient, condition for kids learning something from that teacher, that does indeed lead to learning improvements. And we do see positive results on what I would call theory X style reforms. We do get better performance on what can be observed. Things like teachers showing up, and even in some contexts, contracting on test scores with kind of pay for performance and reward schemes. I'm happy to talk more about when I think we see that result and when we don't, because I know there's a fair bit of conversation about that. I don't think there's a lot of evidence that route X type reforms lead to transformative change. You know, kind of echoing a much smaller scale echo of the account Yamini gave in a paper that came out just in the last couple of weeks. Kartik Muralidharan and Abhijit Singh find that a reform which I think had a kind of theory Y, root Y theory of change at the beginning turns into a root X reform when it meets the world of the bureaucracy that Yamini's been telling us about. So this is in a different state. This is in Madhya Pradesh. But what these scholars find is that a attempt at assessment at a kind of monitoring mechanism, which then was meant to be an input for learning and improvement, does not ever get to the learning and improvement part of that process, right? So we don't see any learning, we don't see any learning gains. We do, however, see increases in required reporting and paperwork. We just layer, you know, we layer that, I don't know, that Indian plug onto the UK outlet or the other way around. I can't remember where we landed. But we add one more layer of complexity and monitoring and just increase that, that tyranny of the paper. And what I find so disturbing about this model is that, in fact, the bureaucratic outputs, the reform plans, the sense that this is a way of reforming because the bureaucracy can see it, because it generates paperwork, in part encourages a scale up of this model, which does no good. Because when the bureaucracy confuses bureaucratic output for performance, it seeks more of it. A system on a tyranny of paper just generates more and more paper.
Just 1 more minute, Dan.
Sure. I'm sorry. I have myself 13 minutes on the count, but I'll wrap right up. So I think accountability is a means to an end, and that end is performance. And if our accountability system undermines performance, it's worth reconsidering. Maximizing results can and often does mean less Route X type focus on monitoring and control. Strengthening real accountability does not mean improving systems for observation and verification. And instead, I think we should do what Yamini wants us to do. That is focus on the street level bureaucrats and those frontline bureaucrats and look at more root Y, more supportive management practice, more trust and collaboration lane management. I think we should take motivation seriously and also think more about norms and peers and that professional ethos she was talking about. Bottom-up accountability doesn't need to be based on accounting either. It can be based more on sort of narrative accounts, on justification. And I think we see evidence that when it works, that can lead to massive, massive gains in education. Not that that's easy to do. I think there's shoots of hope all around. I think I see lots of organizations focusing on igniting intrinsic motivation, on building fellowship, on putting extraordinary people at the center, at supportive management practice around kind of coaching and narrative accountability. In summary, bureaucrats, including education bureaucrats and teachers, are, in my view, people. And in fact, they are often pretty good people. That doesn't mean that building Route Y into our public sector reform efforts is going to be easy, as I think Yamini ably demonstrates, but it will often lead to better performance and is worth doing where we can. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dan, and thank you both, Yamini and Dan. It was really interesting. It's a long time I've heard anything like this. It's really, like Yamini said in the beginning, it's the focus on the classroom, on the teacher, the learning outcomes. So it was really very good. So thank you so much, both. We will now have a little panel discussion, and I have a few questions for you both. But I just to sort of comment before going to specific questions, I think what came to mind to me is that this I'm a development economist myself, and my development economics has gone into really kind of precise causal inference and often smaller things. So your ethnographic study was able to paint the big picture, and it came out very convincingly. Also, I had the chance to read your draft paper, and it just gives this big picture where you then can, and the RISE team in India are lucky to have you, because then they can do their precise studies in the context of the big picture. I do have to say that I'm also a numbers person at the same time. I was astounded by the 8,700 circulars. You know, that's a very productive bureaucracy, I have to say. So that was one of those figures that really struck in your presentation. And then Dan, I haven't heard for the longest time about motivation. That was so refreshing. It's just good. Having been myself, I was a manager for many years, director at the World Bank. I was always trying to say, you guys are intrinsically motivated. That's how this department, you know, operates. But sometimes you don't even have that knowledge, you know, as a manager. Just from my own background, it's a long time ago, I did a paper on motivation of health workers, but we didn't even look at the bureaucrats. We looked at the religious health workers, and indeed they behave differently in terms of their health service, but it's a bold thing to go into that bureaucracy. And also, like when saying that there's very little of that. So the only thing I've read in the more recent years is Michael Lewis's book about the fifth risk. And I like your quote when you said bureaucrats have preferences. Among them is the desire to do the job. And that's from Wilson's famous book, Bureaucracy. That came out in that book so well. But so that's just sort of these kind of reactions excited reactions that come out. I wanted to ask you, Yamini, first. You know, we often hear about the lack of political will. That's always even in the RISE context. I've attended many meetings over the 6 or so years, and it's always that there is the political will. And in your case, you have it. You didn't have a chance to talk so much about the election outcome, but there was a party that came to power that had the will and was ready to politicize education and really make a change. So and then at the same time, you show that the reform was not implemented necessarily how those who had the political will wanted to do it. So what do you think? Where did the chain break down? Was it that the politicians didn't take this into account enough, or didn't know it enough, or can you just highlight that a little more, Yamini?
Sure. Thank you, Ritva, for that really important question. And it's something I did want to talk about as well. So I think, so a couple of things. I think that there's no question that the political will is a necessary condition for moving systems. But the challenge is, how does that political will articulate itself in the everyday life of the reform? And I think this articulation also it differs from context to context. In the specific context that we studied, this particular political party emerges out of a social movement that was by definition anti-establishment, and it sought its approach to reform by bringing in the sort of stakeholders that didn't belong to government, and trying to bypass parts of the government that it believed were locked in an NUI that was just not viable to change. And if I were to look at it from their perspective, I think I would probably have done the same. There are actors in the Indian education bureaucracy. We have another, at least in Delhi, we have this other unique challenge where the career trajectory of a teacher starts in the classroom and ends as an administrator. So all those who sort of made their way finally into the administrative system and were in that sense determining the everyday experiences of teachers were close to retirement, having achieved the pinnacle of success in their careers, but also experiencing a sense of frustration and disenchantment. And therefore weren't the right set of actors to mobilize and bring into the fold. And so they thought, let's create a parallel structure. Let's bring in the NGOs. Let's create the structure of the mentor teachers. Let's work parallelly to the system to infuse change inside the system. And I think that they themselves realized that that itself became its own challenge, because the logic of the system will inevitably come in the way of these new infusions of innovation that they were trying to build. And they weren't able to figure out how best to work with the logic of the system. And I think I've seen this in reforms across India in different contexts, that you can get all this, you can get the framework right, you can get the policy design right. But often that policy design is emerging out of a frustration and an exhaustion with the structure on the ground. And it's seeking ways to bypass that structure in order to push through the outcomes that it is seeking to achieve. Ultimately, reforms are about convincing all those who resist you that change is possible. And that actually is something that perhaps is beyond the scope of a set of political actors that come in, that also have elections on their minds. Inevitably, that is the nature of politics, and it should be. It is about, and I think this is where all of us who are part of the ecosystem of shaping and framing debates on issues of reform also need to play a role in remembering and recognizing and making it okay for reforms to be slow. You will not get drastic changes when you're dealing with these deep entrenched problems. They will be slow, they will have to be carefully done, and they will have to actually get infusing the why that Dan was talking about into an entrenched system that believes X is the only way I can do things requires a retraining of the entire ecosystem of actors. And that's a long haul. It's one that needs to be constantly in conversation with politics. And actually, politics is also very impatient with this. So in many conversations we have with political actors and senior bureaucrats about reform, they're always looking for this, I know the problem, tell me what I can do and tell me how I can do it now. I don't have time. That impatience is important. It moves you to get cracking. But the challenge is that impatience itself often becomes victim of itself. So how do we infuse a new way of thinking about reforms that are deep, that require the entire agency to behave very differently, requires a completely different approach, because the easy thing to do is to just issue another circular and go to the polls.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting. I think in the politics, the time frame is probably what it is, or in a democratic politics like in India. So it's how do you then, both in research, not to mention that usually takes a long time, and then in reform, how do you kind of adjust to that?
But in fact, just one quick thing. In fact, this is a big challenge with education reforms in India from the political perspective, that you actually have seen over the last few decades, occasions when politicians take education seriously, and they do the easy things, or they do the things that are high visibility and quick and necessary. So they build the foundations, building the schools, hiring the teachers, all that stuff gets done. It's when they have to get to the next level of this challenge of learning outcomes that they find themselves in a much more difficult place. And often that's when it becomes much harder. In this particular instance, what the politicians also did was that they kept, even though the reform was about changing the obsession with the pass percentage, they also recognized that's what gets the attention. So you got these contradictory pulls and pressures too, where they would repeatedly say, we're doing so well in the examination, which is exactly the thing that the reforms were trying to break. So it's this, I think we have to remember that you can't be impatient with politics, but you have to recognize the context in which politics plays out for reforms. But you have to start also pursuing the why, because until everything that politicians hear is you got to focus on the why, they're not going to change.
Thank you, Yamini. I think in your work you saw some of the why here and there. Dan, I wanted to ask you really a very specific question about education, and then you are not just researching education, so it's really, I want to come to that. But first, you talked about motivation, and I'm going to give you one example and ask what you think about it. You talked about autonomy. That's part of the why, or can be. In education, we always have, so I come from Finland, an education country. Finland is a country that collaborates a lot with South Africa, and always has, even like 40 years with ANC and so forth. So there is a very close collaboration also in education. And the South Africans picked up the Finnish why. They picked up particularly the or teacher autonomy to their reforms. And I think even in the World Development Report on the Learning Crisis, that's one of the cautionary tales, because it didn't work at all in the South African context. So in a way, my question is, how can you then avoid kind of going overboard? And I think that reform probably just was a negative effect, despite that in Finland, it's the backbone of the pretty good education system.
Thank you. So great question. I am not an expert on Finnish assistance to South Africa. I'm also, by the way, just to be clear, not in particular a scholar of education. Just if I hadn't said that before, I am a little over my skis in an education office, education audience, and I thank you for bearing with me. So you mentioned, when we had our call a couple months ago, or a month ago, you mentioned the Finnish case and the WDR, and that was enough for me to think it might come up here, and to read the WDR and to read the underlying citing paper. So the WDR cites a paper which is Todd and Mason 2005, and that paper finds that the autonomy, which was given to South African teachers, was essentially thrown in without a kind of bigger focus on the sort of transforming the logic of all the actors, right? So, they find that teachers engaged in little reflection and did not develop, quote, their sense of self-efficacy, enthusiasm, and motivation. They find that the reforms were in fact at the wrong level of analysis, and that the correct unit of analysis was less expensive, less complex, and carefully prepared and targeted in-service teacher education. So I'm not an expert on this case, but I think that rather than calling this a failure of theory Y or teacher autonomy, it would be that when we think about reforming bureaucratic systems, we need to think about that system as a kind of whole, and that while autonomy may be a very important feature of the Swedish education system, or I'm sorry, the Finnish education system, apologies, you called it the backbone. Backbones don't do you any good without a brain. They don't do you any good without an arm, right? So even quite critical features of the system can't be transplanted wholesale. And I guess I would suggest that at least is, to me, the lesson we might want to take out of that example.
Yeah, good. So you had even read the background paper, so that's very good. I've always been puzzled by that, and I guess it means that you have to understand and know the system to be effective. But Dan, picking on your expertise and research and experience on other bureaucratic systems, so how does education fit? My own kind of how I come to this, we all come to these things through our experiences. Mine is always the view of the Ministry of Finance. That's how I used to work with the Ministry of Finances. And you see all these guys coming to asking for more money, basically. That's how you often see it. But how is education different? I think in many countries it's the largest service for sure, and the payroll is the largest, and in that sense it's. But are there unique features that you have been able to find during your association with RISE and education work generally?
Yeah, so thank you for the question. I guess I would say that perhaps this is kind of so obvious that that it doesn't need to be said, but one of the really interesting features to me of education is that it's a public administration field, it's a bureaucratic domain in which almost every person on the planet has experience, right? At least as a student, and potentially as a teacher, or as a parent of a child, etc. And I guess that gives me hope for education, right? So that is to say, I think people can imagine what it is to be in a classroom where the teacher and the principal and the other people you can imagine are buried under the tyranny of paperwork that Yamini was telling us about. It's a sector that touches so many lives that, a chief minister or a senior bureaucrat wants to go on the radio and talk about why we should value teachers and put them at the center of making progress and focus on their motivation. So, in some ways, education is also unique, I would say, in that it has this almost good enough to be monitorable and contractable outcome of test scores, right? It has this really tantalizingly attractive idea that we're going to kind of just focus on performance, and we're going to measure that in some way through a standardized test, and then we'll get to outcomes. And I would say that there are not many other sectors in which there is one summary statistic that feels so attractive, but that also where we have the countervailing pressure of so many people being able to imagine the classroom, and I think it following the intuition of most observers, that it would not be so good if the teacher in your classroom or your child's classroom were managed and faced the incentives that Yamini's circulars speak to. I will say, to the extent that we think about education as a domain of bureaucracy from which we can learn for other domains and from other domains, just that insight is to me really worth celebrating. That is to say, I think we often handle these things in silos when we would do better to think about what we can learn from very different kinds of sectors and use to inform others.
Education. Thank you, Dan. Education is embedded in also a bigger system. And another time, not today, but another time we're going to discuss, because my experience, I've done a lot of research in health and also operational work, but research in health as well. Health people take these issues very differently from education. But I want to close this panel session just by a very quick question. For both of you, and then we go into questions that are coming from the audience. I wanted to ask, Yamini, very briefly, 1 minute. Is it possible to create shared values and goals between all these different levels that are driven by these different things and layers, as you discussed? And is it possible, do you think? Because sometimes it feels quite overwhelming, particularly when reading your detailed paper.
It does feel overwhelming, and add to that a socio-political context in which government jobs are always associated with a degree of social status and mobility, which creates its own pulls and pressures. But I think one must remember that, going back to the Wilson quote, bureaucrats come into the system because they are intrinsically motivated to do the job that they have joined, that they have entered into. At least a vast proportion of them. Of all the teachers we interviewed, when we asked them why they joined the teaching profession, an overwhelming number of them spoke about the love for teaching. Then there were all sorts of other things that got added onto it. So I think there's a kernel there. It needs to be it needs to be leveraged and mobilized at the start of one's careers. We come into the system excited and keen. We get bogged down by the memory of what the system gives us, and that's what then frames this very legitimate culture of victimization. I'll end by saying this: one of the in Bihar, in rural Bihar in eastern India, when we were studying school reform reform there, there is a position called a Cluster Resource Center Coordinator, CRCC. And a bureaucrat sort of said, well, you know, in this system, we all become CRCC. So I said, what do you mean by that? So he said, complete rest in comfortable conditions. It is, they too recognize the context in which they are and how they respond to it. We need to be able to mobilize, to motivate them to go back to where they came from, that intrinsic motivation with which they became teachers in the first place.
Thank you very much. I'm going to move now to the chat, and it's full of questions that have been submitted by participants. There is a question that says that scaling supportive management reforms scaling leads to creating manuals, processes, etc., which risk becoming root X, management tools, especially in the Indian context. So how can one scale root Y reforms effectively? So what would you say, Dan, first?
Yeah, thank you. So I would say maybe by not thinking that what the root Y reform is something that we can successfully codify in a manual. That is to say, of course, the education system is going to need manuals, and while perhaps at 8,700 circulars over 3 years, we don't need, what is that? About 10 instructions per day, right? Per workday. Perhaps we don't need that much, but we're going to need some kind of a rule book, right? But maybe we need to think about scaling interventions not just by codifying things, not just by writing them down as a kind of new rule book, but by actually encouraging their use. And that means we're going to get scale through diffusion. And things are going to scale more slowly. But in part to build on the previous question, we're not going to achieve that scale. We're not going to achieve root Y reforms just by layering a new rule book, even a new simpler rule book, on the existing system, but also by changing the kind of de facto CRCC world that bureaucrats find themselves in. And that's going to probably involve removing things, not just adding them.
So Yamini, what would you say to this?
So two things. One, that I think when the everyday dynamic within the hierarchy shifts even subtly, you see fairly dramatic differences in how people talk about their experiences. So in some of the case studies that we have studied, we found bureaucrats talking when the local district bureaucrat, the head of the district administration, calls a meeting, and instead of asking you, where are you on your target, says, what are the difficulties you are confronting in meeting your target, the whole dynamic of the conversation changes. So one, I think one must not forget that deep shifts in behavior will not come through rules. They will come through changing dynamics of interaction. And that is about leadership. So take it back, go to your training room, which is where things get scaled up, at least in the Indian context, and start looking at what are the kinds of leadership training that a district administrator ever gets. Actually, she doesn't. You walk into her system and you're overwhelmed by all that it demands, and demands that are coming to you from your overwhelmed bureaucratic bosses. And so you follow that same pattern of behavior. The other thing that we've noticed is when you enter into mission mode and you align the goals, the resources, and the outcomes neatly together in ways that actors actually can see that they can become participants in the process of change. You see a lot of mobilization and changes of behavior. We saw this even in Delhi. When a small mission was introduced into this big reform, we want to, on such and such day, move all non-readers into readers. Every day, teachers were told you can take the children outside the classroom and here are a set of tools you can use to teach them differently. Skeptical teachers teachers changed their behavior. Students described how the classroom setting was different. So when you go, I think when you infuse missions and people begin to recognize the possibility of change and what it can do, if you do these in repeated forms, perhaps you might see scaled up change. We started out our effort by saying, why is it that the Indian system only works in mission mode and not in its everyday? But I think we need many, many mission modes to get the system to recognize that change is possible at scale, away from rulebook.
Very good. Thank you, Yamini. There are a number of questions. There is a question from Rain Terwind, or maybe Ryan. I don't know exactly how to pronounce it properly to you, Yamini, still about the India case. Is that were they bright spot leaders in the bureaucracy, so that they were role models and had these, like economist says, externalities radiating, and helping to build trust and so forth. So what was their role?
Yeah, so in fact, they had a whole new cadre of teachers was created called mentor teachers. By definition, you'll know what, by their title, you'll know what their role was. And I think these really were the kernels of the change agents that could disrupt things. Of course, a majority of the mentor teachers fell into the trap of the hierarchy and the circulars and the bureaucracy and the context in which they were. But there were, there were people within this cadre that became evangelists of the reform, that became motivated by the fact that they were selected and given exposure and brought to meet the chief minister deputy chief minister on a regular basis. And what they did, they struggled a lot in the classroom, but what they did do was, just by virtue of their mere presence, infuse a conversation about the classroom inside the school. So I think a lot of reform, and then these missions that I was talking about, a lot of the bright spots are about identifying these change agents and then being able to leverage them to, over a period of time, infuse long-term shifts in the everyday life of the system. I think the impatience of reformers is that we expect that these disruptive change agents will move the system as fast as before you can say hooray, and it doesn't quite work like that.
Thank you very much. Then there is a question from Heather Landhorn and Catherine Bain. And let's start with you, Dan. The question goes like, everything you discuss is a long haul, slow, holistic transformation, which of course is what is needed. Still, we have to start somewhere. So how do we insulate the first steps from the political impatience we touched upon earlier? And given the political risks, letting go of root X accountability, etc., what can cause politicians to break from short term? Because they, as we heard from you also, Yamina, and we know it's that the term is completely different. What can cause them to take a long-term reform and invest in root Y? So Dan, why don't you start?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, there is absolutely changing the kind of fundamental logic of bureaucracy is going to take time. And just to echo something Yamini said, I think it starts by making it clear that change is possible and getting people excited about change at a smaller scale. The first step to kindling motivation is not suffocating it. And if we have motivated teachers coming in on the way in, I would suggest that might be an interesting place to start. If we take motivated but inexperienced teachers at entry and they see gains, and those gains get people excited, and students in their classroom are happier, and parents in those classrooms think that things are going better and are in turn happier, to me, that is part of the way we sort of politics proof things or allow things to move on a different time horizon. But I do want to say, I absolutely, I'm a political scientist, maybe. I'm often considered one. And I do want to say that, politics is absolutely a constraint here. But I don't know that I think it is always or even very, very frequently the greatest binding constraint. That is to say, if we think about kind of a political possibility frontier, I think we are very frequently operating inside that frontier. And there are things that are politically possible now that are not being done. That's not to say that it won't be a boundary to systematic transformative change. It will be. But that doesn't mean we can't.
Then who could then lead that change? Who is the, in your thinking, the bright spot that that could do that?
Yeah, well, lots of people can lead that change in the sense that it can come from below, right? It can come from particular schools who choose to, as the mentor teachers Yamini talked about, kind of ignore the circular and focus on the mission, and teachers and schools that buy in. It could be people in the middle level who say, you know what, I'm going to do things differently. It could be a level above that. So you take Yuan Ang's, I think, brilliant work on directed improvisation. It could be a system level or a sort of sector level. So the schools in this district, we're going to allow them to experiment and see what happens. We're going to pilot things. And to political risks, failure is a risk, but so is, of course, the fact that if you give people more autonomy, if you give them more discretion, eventually someone will misuse it. And so thinking about how we sort of variance proof the reform is also something I think worth thinking about. So it needs to be the case that if 99 people do a better job, but one person steals some money from the till, that does not end the reform for everyone. And I think we do that by engaging a broad range of stakeholders in thinking about what this new theory Y world, root Y world can look like.
Mm. Do you want to add, Yamini?
Yeah, just listening to this conversation and reflecting a little bit, I wonder if, one of the contradictions that I saw in the Delhi case was, even as the politicians were pursuing a reform agenda of the classroom that was to take the classroom away from this tyranny of syllabus and pass percentages, they often fell back on sort of sometimes fluke, sometimes perhaps by design, improvements in pass percentages as a political tool to bring front and center into the discourse, in the mainstream politics about the dramatic changes that they were doing inside the classroom. Now, I saw this as giving very contradictory messages inside the classroom, because teachers are being told, don't worry, pass percentages is not what we're going to hold you to, but on the other hand, that's the only thing that you're reading and hearing about in the newspapers and everywhere else. But maybe that's a strategically wise thing to do. Just thinking, these long-term Y reforms are not going to happen immediately, but you have to build and mobilize to ensure that the political gains from the changes that you're making stay with you. Now, did the Delhi government win their election again here in Delhi because of their changes in classrooms, or even what they said about what they did in schools? No, but it certainly helped to create an imagination about a political party that was trying to do something different, and that added to their overall narrative and choices that voters made. So maybe there are some interesting balances between the incentives of politics and the possibilities that politics lays out, and the quiet sort of compromises that are struck on the ground that allow the Y reforms to unfold over periods of time.
Yamini, there is also a question from Melanie Aaron about Delhi. How does teacher professional development reflect or shape the culture and goals of the bureaucracy? For instance, are teachers trained to differentiate their teaching to student abilities or to implement the curriculum? That's the question.
I mean, I think teachers start out with an intuitive understanding of what teaching in the classroom ought to be like, but their training system certainly doesn't equip them for the realities of the classroom that they confront. And so they fall back on the syllabus completion and pass percent. What was particularly interesting to us was in many of the discussions in the training sites where mentor teachers were talking to the teachers about the need for what they call differential teaching. So teach students that were further away from curriculum level expectations in a different way to how you would teach students that were closer to curriculum level expectations. So in the Delhi reform, they reorganized the grades by students that were closer to the classroom, the curriculum level expectations, and students that were further away. And to give you a sense of how far students were, they first took a 33% mark in the examination as the cutoff point for students who were closer to the curriculum versus the other. There were so many kids that got less than 33% that they had to have a different baseline survey to reorganize. So there's a huge gap between what Land calls the negative consequences of our overambitious curriculum were very visible at the start of this reform, and it was to fix that they did this. Teachers were told repeatedly, you can teach children that are further away from the curriculum using different kinds of tools freed from the tyranny of the syllabus. And in the training sessions, there would always be this difficulty with what does that actually mean? So and neither the mentor teacher was well equipped, nor were the teachers to actually engage in a deep and meaningful dialogue around this. So they interpreted it in their own way. Slow down the pace at which you teach. Keep revising consistently and repeatedly. We did very detailed classroom observations to see if there were differences across classroom types. And the only differences that we saw was slowing of pace and repeated revisions in the run-up to the examination between the classrooms that were filled with kids that were further away from the curriculum and those that were filled with kids that were closer to curriculum expectations. So of course, there is a deep story here about teacher professional development and equipping teachers for the realities of the classrooms they face. The other thing that the teachers talk to us a lot about, which I haven't been able to find a place to tell, but it's a story that someone should look into, is that, in urban context, particularly, government schools attract the poorest of the poor students. And a lot of the younger teachers said they came into the schools and they heard and they realized that they were literally the only psychological support system for these children. And there was a very moving story of a teacher that used to often indulge in some forms of corporal punishment and was getting very angry at a student that was falling asleep in the class. And after the class, the student explained that he had to spend the night sleeping on his father's vegetable cart because the government were raising their slums the night before. And so he felt very moved and upset with himself for having reacted this way to the student. So there is actually a very deep psychological burden that teachers also bear, for which they are unprepared, which adds to their sense of not being able to be responsive to the realities that they are confronting. So I think a lot of the intrinsic motivation story, a lot of the why route that Dan is talking about is about professional development, building a coherent set of norms and values that encourage the motivation with which people come into the system. So we do need to start from when they get recruited to how they're socialized into the system.
Thank you, Yamini. Perhaps the last question from our webinar participants. Dan, let me pose this to you. So this comes from Catherine Bain. Do Route Y reforms offer accountability in the way that we expect accountability when using public resources? Is there a risk that we rely on trust and motivation with no accountability? A little bit to my South Africa question, but also different. And have then to cross our fingers and hope that it works. So in a way, I also, in this context, my question was also, what role does trust play? And then trust building takes a long time. But how does that offer the accountability? Having worked a lot in governance and accountability, transparency, those issues, do you have to put your hopes up and hope it works? Or what can you offer in terms of this question, Dan?
Yeah. Too much, so I'll limit myself. I'll be accountable to the time here on the webinar. But let me say just at the outset, I think accountability is a word where I almost always want to know what the person means by the word accountability. And what I mean by that is, if we mean by accountability something like value for money, I would argue that we're not getting too much value for our money at the moment, for our public dollars in terms of educational outcomes. And so if something increases the value without costing more, and thus raises the numerator without changing the denominator, it seems to me that's value for money. And if that's not what we want accountability to get us, well, then what do we want? Sometimes we want sort of visibility, right? Sometimes we want responsiveness. We can want lots of different things when we talk about accountability. But I think ultimately a theory Y, a root Y reform absolutely gives us accountability. It just requires changing what we mean by accountability. It probably means that accountability isn't about whether the teacher completed the syllabus. It probably isn't about whether the teacher performed every one of the 8,760 circulars that they received over a 3-year period. It probably means something else. And if what we care about ultimately is delivering to the public the best public service outcome we can, I think that a system, a root Y system, where we think about accountability not as accounting, but as more of an account, where ultimately we absolutely do have to trust someone, but guess what? I think that's already true. We just kind of obscure it in the system as it is going to lead to more value. There is some risk there. We do have to rethink how we use the term, but I would say we absolutely can, should, need to think about how we embed accountability conceived differently into root Y reforms.
So thanks very much. We are coming to a close, and I want to just really close this webinar first by thanking very much you presenters, Yamini Iyer there in India and Dan Hornik, visiting from SAIS in the Netherlands. I think what you've succeeded, you succeeded in making a kind of boring topic. Like, I guess that's also a myth. We've all been conditioned to think that it's boring. It's actually not. It's fascinating what happens there. You surely, in different ways, have Yamini with the Delhi experience, that in depth, and you, Dan, bringing the motivation. That's a noble thing. That's when you are a human being, you really, just motivation is positive. Everybody can recognize the results of it. So you've just succeeded to make it so interesting and exciting. And I think there's some of these I surely will implement in my both teaching and research plans. I think because sometimes when you look at the system, it's really complex and you don't know what to focus on. And at least here, you in this seminar, you could see how you can go about of figuring out the big picture and what issues to focus when you think about that part of the system, the bureaucratic civil servants part of the system. So I, of course, have to say, I come personally from a culture that values that. Public service is valued. It's also a lot of norms, and we, all these countries we have been talking about here, they have very different norms. So that's of course is reflected. I really want to thank you, Yamini and Dan. I want to thank the audience for great questions and for participating, as well as the RISE team who has so ably organized and prepared this webinar. So it was my pleasure to be your chair and learn a lot. So thank you all. And over to you, Carmen, now. Carmen, sorry.
Yes, thank you. I'm still so struck, and I can only echo what Ritva said, the complementarities of different diverse backgrounds and expertise coming together on this, really challenging our preconceived notions about bureaucracies and bureaucrats. I think that was just splendid and brilliant. Also, on behalf of RISE, thank you so much to Dan and Yamini for presenting this research. Thank you, Ritva, for facilitating a brilliant and lively discussion, for asking the tough questions also. That was fantastic. Not least, thank you everyone at RISE and the Blavatnik School, all the people working behind the scenes to make this happen. So Jamie, Katie, Joe, Jason, and Lily. And one final sort of public and service announcement. As I said, this will be the final webinar of 2020. We will be back with more public events in 2021. So in the meantime, if you'd like to stay up to date on updates around our research and other events, you can subscribe to the RISE mailing list or follow us on Twitter, and we will pick this up with a lot of new exciting topics in the new year. Until then, thank you so much for your interest and for your time, and stay safe, stay healthy, and we hope to see you again next year. Thank you, everybody. Goodbye.